My husband said, "Stop acting like you own me. You don't get to tell me where I go or who I'm with." Everyone laughed. I just smiled and said, "You're right, we're not together anymore." When he came home that night, his key didn't work, the locks were changed, the neighbor told him something he'll never forget. But let me back up. Let me tell you exactly how we got here. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but mine was 7 years in the making, and I'd made sure every ingredient was perfect. That night at the Luxury Business Summit, as Sterling laughed at me in front of everyone we knew, I tasted victory before he even knew the game had started. The Grand Marquis Ballroom was everything you'd expect from an event where the city's elite gathered to network and be seen. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors polished to mirrors. Ice sculptures shaped like swans melted slowly beside champagne fountains that flowed like liquid gold. Women wore designer gowns that cost more than cars. Men wore success like expensive cologne that filled every corner of the room. And I wore red. Red Valentino dress, red Louboutins, red lipstick the color of fresh wounds. Sterling noticed me the moment I walked in. I saw his jaw tighten across the crowded room. But he didn't approach me, didn't acknowledge me, didn't even nod. He was too busy holding court at the bar. His arm wrapped possessively around Esme Dubois, like she was a trophy he'd just won at auction. She wore emerald green that night, and the way she pressed her body against my husband left absolutely no room for doubt about what they were to each other. I'd known for months, of course, had the photos and bank statements to prove every lie. But knowing and seeing are two different kinds of pain. I approached them calmly, professionally, with the practiced composure of a woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar company from the ground up. I'd even rehearsed my smile in the hotel mirror that morning. Pleasant, neutral, unbothered. The smile of someone who had nothing to hide and everything under control. "Sterling," I said, my voice steady despite the champagne-fueled noise around us and the pounding of my own heart. "I need to speak with you about the Henderson account. They're requesting revised terms by Monday, and we need to discuss strategy." He didn't even look at me, just waved his hand dismissively like I was a waitress interrupting his important conversation with important people. The colleagues clustered around the bar shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a tennis match they didn't want to witness. Someone coughed into their champagne flute. Another suddenly found the ice sculpture fascinating enough to study intently. Esme's smile sharpened into something predatory, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed triumph as she tightened her grip on Sterling's arm. "It's important," I pressed, keeping my tone light and professional even as my nails dug crescents into my palms. "It'll only take a moment of your time." That's when he turned, when he saw his golden opportunity to assert dominance in front of an audience. Sterling Blackwood had always been beautiful when he was cruel, and tonight he was devastatingly handsome in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, the one I'd paid for, though he'd never acknowledged that inconvenient truth. With his dark hair perfectly styled with just enough product to look effortless, his jaw set in that confident angle that photographs so well, he looked like power incarnate. He looked like a man who'd built an empire with his bare hands and couldn't be touched by anyone, least of all his increasingly inconvenient wife. He looked like a man who had absolutely no idea that his entire world was already ending, that the ground beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes had already turned to quicksand. "Stop acting like you own me," he said, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent circle of colleagues, clients, and competitors who all turned to watch. His eyes glittered with something ugly and triumphant as he delivered the line he'd probably been rehearsing for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. "You don't get to tell me where I go or who I'm with anymore, Anya, so just stop embarrassing yourself." The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. 300 people in evening wear suddenly frozen like mannequins, waiting to see how the humiliated wife would react. Then someone laughed, a nervous, uncomfortable sound that gave permission to others, and the laughter spread like wildfire through our professional circle. I stood there in my red dress, feeling every eye on me, feeling the heat of humiliation crawl up my neck like poison ivy. This was the moment Sterling had been building toward for months. the public assertion of dominance, the reminder to everyone watching that I was just the wife, easily dismissed, easily replaced, easily erased. He wanted me to cry, to beg, to make a scene he could use against me in divorce court later, fuel for his narrative of the unstable, controlling woman. Instead, I smiled. Not a fake smile, not a broken smile, but a real smile that came from somewhere deep and dark and satisfied. "You're right," I said, my voice clear and steady as a bell cutting through the awkward laughter. "We're not together anymore." The laughter died instantly, like someone had cut the power to the entire ballroom, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. I turned on my heel and walked out with my spine straight and my head held high, red Louboutins clicking against marble like a countdown timer. I didn't run, didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, just left trailing silence behind me like a cape. The valet brought my car around, a sleek black Mercedes registered in my name, bought with my money, though Sterling drove it more than I did, and I tipped generously before sliding behind the wheel. Only when I pulled into the glittering city night did I finally let myself breathe, let my hands shake just once on the steering wheel before steadying them again. Because here's what Sterling didn't know. As he basked in what he thought was his victory, the divorce papers had been filed that morning at 9 a.m. sharp. While I'd been getting my hair done for the summit, Silas Novak, the most ruthless family attorney in the city, the man who dismantled prenups for billionaires, had walked those papers into the courthouse. At 6 p.m., while I'd been touching up my lipstick in the hotel powder room, a locksmith I'd hired 3 weeks ago was changing every lock on the Penthouse. At midnight, Owen Beck at our bank would freeze every account Sterling thought he controlled, every credit card he thought was his to use. And right now, at 10:47 p.m. according to my dashboard clock, Sterling was probably leaving the summit, probably heading home, riding high on his public humiliation of me. I pulled into the Carlisle Hotel parking garage and sat in the darkness for a moment, checking my phone for the text I knew was coming. At 11:32 p.m., it buzzed. A message from Nico Flores, our neighbor, the quiet man who'd watched Sterling and Esme's affair unfold for months in our building's hallways. Message delivered. It read, "You should have seen his face." I poured myself a glass of wine in my hotel suite, Bordeaux from a vintage I'd selected and Sterling had taken credit for, and raised it to my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Because somewhere across the city, Sterling Blackwood was standing outside a penthouse he thought was his, watching his key fail to turn in the lock, and hearing Nico tell him something he'd never forget. "She said to tell you that you don't live here anymore, Mr. Blackwood. And one more thing, you never did. Let the fall begin." 3 months before the summit, I didn't know I was already at war. I was still trying to save my marriage, still believing that the distance between Sterling and me was temporary, something we could fix with date nights and honest conversations. I was still stupidly, desperately hopeful that the man I'd married 7 years ago was somewhere underneath the stranger who came home later and later each night. I didn't know that while I was lighting candles for romantic dinners, he was already planning my erasure from the company we'd built together, from the life I'd created for us. It started with perfume, a scent that wasn't mine clinging to Sterling's collar when he came home at midnight on a Tuesday. Not my Chanel, not my Jo Malone, but something heavier, sweeter, more deliberate, the kind of perfume a woman wears when she wants to be remembered. He'd kissed my forehead absently and headed straight for the shower, and I'd stood there in our kitchen holding a glass of wine, telling myself I was being paranoid. But I'm a financial analyst, I spot patterns for a living, and Sterling had become the easiest pattern to read. Late nights, vague explanations, a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The perfume lingered in our bedroom that night, foreign and invasive, like an intruder I couldn't see but knew was there. The calendar was next, and calendars don't lie the way people do. Sterling and I had always shared a digital calendar, color-coded, meticulously maintained, the backbone of running both a company and a marriage. But suddenly there were blocks of time labeled strategy meetings appearing at odd hours, 10 p.m. on Fridays when any legitimate business meeting would be long over, Sunday mornings when our office was closed and locked. When I asked about them casually over coffee, "Who are you meeting with on Sunday morning?" he'd barely looked up from his phone. "Client development?" Nothing exciting, he'd said, as if I were an annoying assistant questioning the boss's schedule rather than his wife and business partner asking a reasonable question. Then came Esme Dubois, and everything started making terrible, perfect sense. Sterling introduced her at a Monday morning staff meeting as our new brand consultant, hired to help us elevate our market presence, whatever that meant. I'd stared at him across the conference table, my coffee going cold in my hands, because this was the first I'd heard of any new hire, any consulting contract, any decision that should have required my input as CO founder. She was elegant in that calculated way some women perfect. Silk blouse, tailored pants, heels that added just enough height to be commanding without being aggressive. When she shook my hand, her smile was warm, and her grip was firm, and I knew immediately that she was dangerous. I watched them during that first presentation, the way Esme touched Sterling's arm when making a point, the inside jokes that already existed between them though she'd supposedly just been hired. She used phrases like leverage our brand equity and optimize our market positioning without saying anything substantive, and Sterling nodded along like she was delivering profound wisdom from on high. The other employees looked confused. We'd always been a company that valued substance over style, but Sterling was mesmerized, leaning in when she spoke, laughing too loudly at comments that weren't funny. I sat at the head of the conference table in the company I'd built and felt like a stranger in my own boardroom. The financial red flags came next, because numbers always tell the truth eventually. I was reviewing quarterly expenses when I saw it. $75,000 paid to Dubois Brand Consulting over 3 months, with invoices so vague, they were essentially blank checks. Strategic consultation, $15,000, brand development, $20,000. No detailed breakdown, no measurable deliverables, no reports or presentations to justify that kind of spending. For context, our top-performing account manager made $85,000 a year, and Esme had made nearly that much in 3 months for work I couldn't identify or quantify. I pulled every invoice, every contract, every email trail, and found nothing but smoke and mirrors dressed up in corporate language. When I confronted Sterling about it, calmly, professionally, with spreadsheets printed out and highlighted, he exploded in a way I'd never seen before. "You're being paranoid and controlling," he'd shouted, his face flushing red with anger that seemed disproportionate to my question. "Esme is helping us expand into new markets, but you're too focused on nickel and diming everything to see the bigger picture. Why can't you just trust me?" The accusation landed like a slap. I was the problem, not the unexplained $75,000, not the woman with no verifiable credentials billing us for phantom work. Me, for asking questions, for doing my job, for noticing that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. That's when the gaslighting pattern became impossible to ignore, and I started documenting everything because I no longer trusted my own memory against his revisionist history. Every concern I raised was dismissed as paranoia. Every question was evidence of my controlling nature. Every instinct was proof that I was insecure and jealous and fundamentally unable to handle his success. "You've always been threatened by confident women," he'd say, rewriting years of me championing female employees and mentoring women in our industry. "You're holding the company back with your risk-averse approach," he'd claim, though my risk-averse financial management was the only reason we were profitable. He was systematically making me doubt myself, question my judgment, feel crazy for noticing things that were objectively happening right in front of me. My best friend Layla Shaw noticed the change in me before I was ready to admit it myself. The weight loss, the dark circles, the way I'd started second-guessing every sentence before I spoke. We met for coffee on a Wednesday afternoon, and she'd taken one look at me and said, "What's he doing to you, Anya?" Not what's wrong, but what's he doing, as if she could see the invisible bruises Sterling's words had left. I'd broken down right there in the coffee shop, whispering my suspicions about Esme, about the money, about the perfume and the calendar, and the way Sterling looked at me now like I was an obstacle to remove rather than a partner to cherish. Layla had reached across the table and gripped my hand hard enough to hurt. "Trust your instincts. You're not crazy. And whatever you need, whenever you need it, I'm here." The hotel receipt was the final piece, the proof that transformed suspicion into certainty. I'd found it in Sterling's jacket pocket when taking his suits to the dry cleaner. A task I'd done out of habit, out of the muscle memory of being a wife to a man who no longer deserved my care. The Grand Marquis Hotel, Penthouse Suite, $1,847 for one night, dated 3 weeks ago on a Saturday. Sterling had told me he was at a conference in Boston, but there was no conference. I'd checked after finding the receipt, searched every industry website and came up empty. Just Sterling and someone else in a penthouse suite that cost more than most people's monthly rent, paid for with our company credit card under the category Client Entertainment. I stood in our bedroom holding that receipt, and something inside me shifted permanently, from hurt to cold, calculated fury. This wasn't just an affair conducted in shadows and denials. This was systematic, arrogant, stupid in its carelessness. Sterling thought I was too busy, too trusting, too in love to notice or care that he was stealing from our company to fund his betrayal. He'd underestimated me so completely that he didn't even bother covering his tracks properly. Didn't shred his receipts, didn't clear his browser history, didn't change his passwords. His arrogance would be his downfall. But first, I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went, and who owned what when the empire inevitably crumbled. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't looked at spreadsheets the same way since. While Sterling snored peacefully in our bed that suddenly felt contaminated by his presence, I sat in my home office with every financial record from the past year spread across my desk like evidence at a crime scene. Coffee went cold in my cup as the hours ticked past midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m., and I traced every dollar that had flowed from Blackwood Luxury Solutions to Dubois Brand Consulting. The paper trail was messy, but followable if you knew what to look for, and ID spent 7 years learning to read between the lines of corporate finance. What I found made my hands shake with rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. Esme's consulting company was a shell, a pretty facade with nothing behind it. No employees, no office address beyond a P.O. box, no website, no LinkedIn presence, no business license registration in the city or state databases I searched. For a woman supposedly helping us optimize our brand presence, she had no digital footprint whatsoever, no portfolio of past clients, no case studies or testimonials or any evidence that Dubois Brand Consulting had ever consulted on anything. Just a bank account that had been opened 4 months ago, conveniently right before Sterling hired her, receiving regular transfers from our company for services that existed only on fraudulent invoices. I pulled up the incorporation documents, filed in Delaware, a common choice for shell companies because of the state's privacy protections, with a registered agent service that specialized in helping people hide ownership structures. The offshore accounts were harder to find, but I'd worked in finance long enough to know where money goes when people don't want it found. I accessed our company's primary business account. I still had full administrator privileges because Sterling had never thought to revoke, and followed the wire transfers that originated from Esme's shell company. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity and brazen in its criminality. Money flowed from Blackwood Luxury Solutions to Dubois Brand Consulting as consulting fees, then within days transferred out to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Not even particularly sophisticated tax havens, just the most obvious choice for someone who'd watched too many movies about hiding money and thought they were being clever. The real estate searches in Sterling's email were what transformed this from simple theft into a complete betrayal of everything we'd built together. I still had access to the email account we'd set up for shared business correspondence. Another thing Sterling had forgotten to change, another example of his arrogant assumption that I'd never look, never question, never fight back. Property alerts for luxury apartments in Paris's 16th arrondissement, saved searches for Monaco penthouses with harbor views, inquiry emails to international real estate agents about relocating for business opportunities in Europe. He wasn't just stealing from the company, he was planning his exit, his new life, his future with Esme funded by money I'd helped earn, from a business I'd helped build from nothing. This wasn't just an affair anymore. Wasn't just about sex or ego or the cliché of a man in his 40s chasing validation from a younger woman. Sterling and Esme had been systematically embezzling company funds and planning to push me out entirely, to dissolve Blackwood Luxury Solutions and rebrand it under a new name, I'd found the draft LLC paperwork saved in a shared cloud folder labeled Paris Plans. They were going to announce I was stepping back from the business due to personal reasons, restructure everything under a new corporate entity that wouldn't include my name or ownership stake, and disappear to Europe with what they'd stolen. The new company would be called Sterling Dubois International, because apparently even in crime Sterling couldn't resist putting his name first. I almost laughed at the audacity, the breathtaking stupidity of documenting your own fraud in files labeled embezzlement strategy might as well have been the folder name. That's when I pulled out 7 years of incorporation documents, partnership agreements, and property deeds. Every piece of paper Sterling had signed without reading, because he was too busy playing CEO to bother with boring legal stuff. I needed to know exactly what I owned, what he owned, and where the battle lines would be drawn when this inevitably ended in court. I spread the documents across my office floor because my desk was too small to contain the empire we'd built, and I read every single page with the focused intensity of someone whose entire life depended on understanding the fine print. What I discovered made me feel like I'd been holding a loaded gun this entire time without realizing it. The Penthouse, the one Sterling had toured with real estate agents while I was at work, the one he'd acted like he'd purchased for us, the one he'd told friends and colleagues he'd invested in, was titled under Volkov Holdings LLC, a company I'd established in my maiden name. The company itself, Blackwood Luxury Solutions, was structured so that I held 60% ownership through a holding company while Sterling held 40% directly. I'd set it up that way for tax purposes, and Sterling had signed off without questioning why. Even the cars in our garage, the art on our walls, the investment portfolio he thought was ours, all legally mine, structured through entities I'd created and he'd signed off on with barely a glance. Sterling had been living in my castle, driving my cars, spending my money, and plotting to steal my company without ever realizing that legally, contractually, irrefutably, almost none of it was his. Sterling always said I worried too much about paperwork, rolled his eyes when I'd present him with contracts and agreements to sign for our various business entities. "Just sign here, darling," he'd say, barely glancing at documents I'd spent days preparing with attorneys, treating legal protections like annoying formalities that got in the way of his vision. His arrogance was breathtaking, the assumption that paperwork was beneath him, that the boring details of corporate structure were my job, while the real work of building the brand was his domain. It was also his fatal flaw, the crack in his armor that would bring down his entire world, because while he'd been playing king, giving interviews about his entrepreneurial success and networking at industry events, I'd been building the kingdom and putting my name on every single brick. I sat in my home office at 3 a.m., surrounded by 7 years of documents, and something crystallized inside me that was colder and harder than grief. I wouldn't confront Sterling about what I'd found. I wouldn't give him the chance to explain or apologize or gaslight me into doubting what the numbers clearly showed. I wouldn't cry or beg or ask him why I wasn't enough, because this wasn't about me not being enough. This was about him being fundamentally flawed in ways I'd chosen not to see. I would dismantle him methodically, legally, completely, using the same strategic thinking I'd applied to building our company. He wanted to erase me from the business? I'd erase him from everything. The decision settled over me like armor, protective and cold and absolutely certain in its righteousness. I pulled out my phone and searched for the name Layla had mentioned months ago, Silas Novak, the family attorney whose reputation for ruthlessly dismantling prenups and corporate structures was legendary in our city. Then I searched for private investigators, because I needed more than financial records. I needed photos, communications, irrefutable evidence that would stand up in both divorce court and criminal proceedings. Sterling had made this a war. He just didn't know the battle had already started and he was already losing. I looked at the clock, 3:47 a.m., and the first birds were starting to sing outside my window, heralding a dawn that felt more like an ending than a beginning. In a few hours, Sterling would wake up and go through his morning routine, would kiss my cheek absently and head to the office without knowing that his wife had just spent the night building his destruction from his own documents. I closed my laptop, filed every document back into its folder with meticulous care, and allowed myself one moment of grief, Not for Sterling, but for the woman I'd been 24 hours ago, who still believed in the possibility of us. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone harder and smarter and utterly unwilling to be erased from her own life story. Cassian Hale's office wasn't an office at all, but a corner table at a coffee shop in a neighborhood where nobody from my social circle would ever think to look for me. Layla had given me his number with a warning. He's expensive, he's cynical, and he doesn't care about your feelings. But he's the best at finding truth when people are trying to hide it. I'd called him from a burner phone I'd purchased with cash, and when he'd answered, his voice had been flat and professionally distant. Coffee shop on 8th and Morrison, tomorrow at 2 p.m., come alone. I'd arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a black coffee I wouldn't drink, and waited at a back table while my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. When Cassian walked in, gray jacket, forgettable face, eyes that missed nothing, I knew immediately that this man lived in shadows and had seen every ugly thing people do to each other. I laid out everything I knew methodically, keeping my voice low and steady despite the rage that threatened to crack through my composure with every word. The affair with Esme, the shell company funneling money offshore, the real estate searches for Paris apartments, the plan to dissolve the company and rebrand it without me. I showed him printed emails, bank statements, property searches, everything I'd compiled during sleepless nights while Sterling snored peacefully in our bed, oblivious to the evidence I was building against him. I need proof that will stand up in court, I told Cassian, my hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. Photos, communications, financial records that can't be explained away as misunderstandings or creative accounting. He'd listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook with handwriting so small I couldn't read it upside down, and when I finished, he looked up with eyes that held no sympathy, only assessment. Men like your husband think they're untouchable, Cassian said, closing his notebook with a snap that sounded like a trap closing. They operate on arrogance and assumption, the assumption that their wives are too trusting, too busy, too in love to notice the patterns. He leaned back in his chair, and something in his expression was almost bored, like he'd seen this exact story play out 100 times with only the names and bank account numbers changing. The good news for you, Mrs. Blackwood, is that arrogant men always leave a trail because they don't believe anyone is smart enough or motivated enough to follow it. His fee was $15,000 up front plus expenses, payable from an account Sterling didn't have access to, and he'd have preliminary findings within a week. I'd transferred the money before leaving the coffee shop, and Cassian had disappeared into the afternoon crowd, like he'd never existed at all. The surveillance began immediately, and Cassian's operational plan was comprehensive enough to make me wonder what he'd done before becoming a private investigator. Track Sterling and Esme's movements using GPS trackers placed on their vehicles, access phone records through methods Cassian described as legally gray but practically effective. Follow the money across international borders using contacts in banking and financial regulation he refused to name. He'd hack Esme's cloud storage, social media accounts, and email if given the opportunity. People store their entire lives digitally now, he'd said, and they use passwords like their pet's name or their birthday, like they're trying to make my job easier. Within 72 hours, Cassian had mapped their routines with military precision. Sterling's gym schedule, Esme's favorite restaurants, the hotel they preferred for their afternoon meetings. The surveillance felt intrusive and necessary in equal measure, and I tried not to think about what it meant that I'd hired someone to document my husband's betrayal frame by frame. The first week's report arrived in a manila envelope delivered to Layla's office, and I'd opened it in her conference room with hands that shook, despite my attempts at composure. Sterling and Esme had met 3 times at the Grand Marquis Hotel Penthouse suite, the same suite from the receipt I'd found, and Cassian's time-stamped photos told a story that needed no narration. Tuesday at 7 p.m., Sterling and Esme entering the hotel lobby, her hand on his lower back, both dressed like they were going to dinner, not to bed. Wednesday at 11 p.m., room service cart outside the Penthouse suite door, 2 champagne flutes visible. Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m., both of them leaving separately, Sterling in yesterday's suit, looking satisfied, Esme in sunglasses despite the cloudy morning. The photos were clinical, cold, irrefutable. frozen moments of betrayal captured in high resolution. I'd stared at them until they stopped looking like my husband and became just another cheating man caught in the act, and I'd filed them methodically in a folder labeled Evidence with the date and timestamp written on each one. The digital forensics were even more damning than the photos, because while pictures can be explained away as just dinner or business meetings, internal documents reveal intention and planning. Cassian had accessed Esme's cloud storage. He didn't explain how, and I didn't ask, and found a treasure trove of incriminating files, draft business plans for Sterling Dubois International, financial projections that included all of Blackwood Luxury Solutions' current clients, but none of its current expenses or ownership structure, email threads discussing how to transition Anya out gracefully so the rebrand would seem like a natural evolution rather than a hostile takeover. They'd planned everything, except for the possibility that I'd notice, that I'd care enough to fight back, that I'd be smart enough to own the castle they were trying to steal. Cassian had downloaded everything to an encrypted hard drive and made 3 backup copies because he said in court, redundancy was survival. The Paris connection solidified when Cassian followed them to a real estate office in the city's financial district where they'd met with an international property agent specializing in European luxury markets. He'd sent me photos of Sterling and Esme touring a €4 million apartment in Paris's 16th arrondissement through video calls with the agent. You could see them in the office, conference room, gesturing at a laptop screen showing marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seine. They were shopping for their future together, using money stolen from our present, and they were doing it during business hours, brazenly, like this was just another investment property rather than evidence of systematic fraud. Cassian had obtained copies of the property inquiry emails, saved searches, and financing pre-approval letters that Sterling had submitted, listing himself as CEO and sole owner of Blackwood Luxury Solutions. The lie was in writing now, notarized by his own arrogance. But it was Esme's background check that made my blood run cold and made me realize I'd been competing with a professional, not just another woman. Cassian had traced her history through 2 previous relationships with wealthy married men, a hedge fund manager in Boston and a real estate developer in Chicago, both of which had ended with quiet settlements and non-disclosure agreements. She'd positioned herself as a consultant, worked her way into their businesses and their beds, collected evidence of financial irregularities which she'd likely helped create, and then extracted 6-figure settlements in exchange for silence. She's a predator, Cassian had written in his report, and your husband is just her latest mark. The difference is, she didn't count on you being the one who actually owns everything. Esme Dubois wasn't even her real name. She'd been born Emily Dawson in suburban Pennsylvania, had reinvented herself with a fake French surname and a fabricated resume, and had been running this con for at least 5 years across 3 cities. Sterling's carelessness reached almost comedic levels when Cassian presented me with recorded phone calls, obtained through methods I absolutely did not want explained to me, of Sterling bragging to his college friend Marcus about his exit strategy. I'm setting it up so Anya thinks she's being pushed out for legitimate business reasons, Sterling had said on a call from his car, his voice full of smug satisfaction. She'll get a settlement, sign an NDA, and I'll rebrand everything in Europe with Esme. Clean break, fresh start, and honestly, Anya's been holding the company back for years with her risk-averse approach. He'd laughed then, actually laughed, discussing my elimination from the company I'd built like it was an amusing business problem he'd solved cleverly. Marcus had asked if he felt bad about it, and Sterling's response was immediate. Dude, this is business, she'll be fine. She'll probably thank me eventually for freeing her from the stress. When Cassian delivered the full report 3 weeks after our first meeting, it was 200 pages of documented betrayal, backed by a USB drive containing photos, recordings, financial records, and digital forensics that could survive any legal challenge. We met at the same coffee shop, same corner table, and he'd slid the envelope across to me like he was delivering a verdict, which, in a way, he was. You have everything you need to destroy him legally, Cassian said, his voice devoid of emotion, stating fact rather than offering opinion. Criminal fraud charges, divorce with cause, corporate malfeasance, take your pick. He'd paused then, studying my face with those assessing eyes that had seen too much of humanity's ugly side. Mrs. Blackwood, you didn't just marry a cheater, you married an amateur thief who thought he was clever. He's not. I'd almost smiled at that, almost let myself feel the vindication rising in my chest like a tide. Instead, I'd thanked him professionally, transferred the final payment, and asked one more question. Esme has a husband? Cassian had nodded. Investment banker, works in the city, no idea his wife is a professional con artist. Want me to send him the photos? I'd considered it for exactly 3 seconds before nodding. Yes. He deserves to know what he's married to. Cassian had allowed himself the smallest smile then. Already done. Silas Novak's law office occupied the top floor of a glass tower downtown, and everything about it screamed power. From the receptionist, who looked like she'd stepped out of Vogue, to the original artwork on the walls that probably cost more than most people's houses. I'd called for an appointment using a recommendation from Owen Beck at our bank, and Silas's assistant had somehow found space in his schedule the next day, which told me that Owen had called ahead and used whatever influence he had to prioritize my case. When Silas emerged from his corner office to greet me, silver-haired, sharp-suited, with eyes that could dissect a contract at 50 paces, he'd extended his hand and said simply, "Mrs. Blackwood, I've been expecting someone like you for years. Men like your husband always underestimate their wives, and it's always their fatal mistake." I'd followed him into his conference room, and the wall of windows overlooking the city had felt like a metaphor for what we were about to do: tear down the illusion and expose everything to harsh daylight. I spread 7 years of documents across Silas's conference table like I was laying out battle plans, because that's exactly what they were. Incorporation papers, property deeds, partnership agreements, tax filings, every piece of paper that defined the legal structure of our life together. Silas had pulled on reading glasses and worked through the documents with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays before a complex operation. He'd asked questions about dates and signatures, about who had handled which aspects of the business formation, about whether Sterling had ever consulted his own attorney or simply signed what I'd put in front of him. He trusted you completely, Silas observed, and there was something almost pitying in his tone. Not for me, but for Sterling, who'd been so arrogant he'd signed away his own kingdom without realizing it. After 90 minutes of review, Silas had leaned back in his chair and delivered his assessment with the kind of certainty that comes from 30 years of dismantling marriages and corporations. "Mrs. Blackwood, you own everything. The company, the penthouse, the cars. All of it is titled under holding companies in your name or controlled through corporate structures where you hold majority ownership," Silas explained, spreading the documents out and pointing to signatures and filing dates. "Your husband has been living in your castle, spending your money, driving your vehicles, and treating you like a guest in your own life." He'd pulled out a legal pad and started mapping the ownership structures in a flowchart that looked like a family tree, showing how every major asset traced back to entities I'd established and controlled. The Penthouse was owned by Volkov Holdings, LLC, my maiden name, registered before we were married, with Sterling, listed only as an authorized resident, not an owner. The company shares were split 60-40, but my 60% was held through another holding company that gave me unilateral control over major decisions. Even our investment portfolio was titled as Anya Volkov Blackwood, with Sterling Blackwood as beneficiary, which meant I could revoke his access with a single signature. Silas explained how my meticulous planning years ago, when we'd first started the company and I'd been the one with financial expertise, while Sterling had been the charming frontman, had created an almost impenetrable legal fortress with me at the center. I'd structured everything to be tax-efficient and lawsuit-resistant, creating layers of holding companies and trusts that protected assets from creditors and liability. What I hadn't realized at the time was that I'd also protected everything from Sterling himself, because he'd never bothered to understand what he was signing, never questioned why certain documents needed his signature or what rights he was agreeing to. "Most couples divide ownership equally," Silas noted, "but you created a structure where you hold unilateral control over almost everything. Did you do this intentionally?" I'd shaken my head. At the time, I'd just been following best practices from my finance background, treating our personal assets like a corporate portfolio. But the result was the same. Sterling had no legal leg to stand on when this went to court. Sterling's oversight was so complete, so absolute, that Silas actually chuckled while reviewing the documents. Not a warm laugh, but the dry amusement of an attorney who'd seen overconfident men destroy themselves through negligence. Because I'd handled all legal and financial paperwork for our business and personal life, Sterling had simply signed where I'd indicated, barely glancing at documents I'd spent days preparing with attorneys and accountants. His ego made him vulnerable, Silas observed, pointing to a partnership agreement where Sterling had signed away veto power over major business decisions. He thought the boring work was beneath him. The contracts, the corporate filings, the tax structures. He wanted to be the visionary CEO, while you handled the tedious details. Those tedious details are now the weapon you'll use to dismantle his entire world. The irony was almost poetic. Sterling's arrogance about his own importance had blinded him to the legal reality of his powerlessness. The divorce strategy Silas outlined was comprehensive, coordinated, and designed to happen with such speed that Sterling wouldn't have time to react or retaliate before it was too late. File for divorce citing emotional cruelty and adultery, supported by Cassian's evidence and Dr. Sheehan's therapy notes. Simultaneously, freeze all shared bank accounts and credit cards. I had the legal authority to do this since my name was primary on everything. Change the locks on the Penthouse and revoke Sterling's access to company offices and systems. File corporate fraud charges based on the embezzlement evidence, which would trigger a board meeting where I'd vote to remove him as CEO using my majority ownership. And finally, issue a press release announcing Sterling's departure from the company due to financial irregularities currently under investigation, which would destroy his professional reputation before he could spin the narrative. Everything must happen simultaneously, Silas emphasized, his finger tapping the timeline he'd drawn on his legal pad. If he gets wind of any single piece of this plan, he'll start moving money, deleting evidence, calling attorneys. We need overwhelming force applied all at once so he's paralyzed by the scope of it. The timeline required precision choreography worthy of a heist film, and Silas walked me through every step like a general explaining battle strategy. 3 weeks from now, the night of the luxury business summit where Sterling would be surrounded by colleagues and feeling invincible, we'd file the divorce papers at closing time so they'd be official, but Sterling wouldn't receive notice until the next day. At 6 p.m. that night, while Sterling was still at the event, a locksmith would change all penthouse locks and building security would be notified that Sterling Blackwood was no longer a resident. At midnight, Owen Beck would freeze accounts and cancel credit cards. At 9 a.m. the following morning, a board meeting would convene to vote on Sterling's removal. The vote would pass because I controlled enough shares to unilaterally approve it, and security would escort him from the building. By noon, the press release would go out. By the end of that day, Sterling Blackwood would have no home, no money, no job, and no reputation. This will be public and ugly, Silas warned me. Are you prepared for that? Dr. Vivian Chian's therapy notes became an unexpected weapon in our arsenal. Documentation I hadn't even known existed until Silas explained that counseling records could be subpoenaed in divorce cases involving claims of emotional abuse. Sterling and I had attended 6 sessions 3 months earlier when I'd still been trying to save our marriage, and Dr. Sheehan had documented every dismissive comment, every gaslighting statement, every moment where Sterling had minimized my concerns or blamed me for his behavior. You're too sensitive, he'd told me in one session, according to Dr. Chian's notes. Successful men have different needs than regular people. If you can't handle the pressure of being married to someone like me, maybe you're not cut out for this life. Silas had smiled when he read that particular entry. Judges hate men who talk like this, he'd said. This establishes a pattern of emotional cruelty that supports your claim of an abusive marriage. Dr. Sheehan's notes would become part of the divorce filing, evidence that Sterling's behavior had been systematically harmful long before I discovered the affair. Owen Beck at our primary bank was the final piece of the legal puzzle, and Silas contacted him directly to verify account ownership and prepare for the coordinated asset freeze. Owen and I had worked together for years. He'd helped structure our business accounts, had advised on investment strategies, had been copied on every major financial decision, and he'd always been professionally courteous but distant. But when Silas called him and explained what we were planning, Owen had apparently said something that made Silas laugh. Finally. I've been waiting for Mrs. Blackwood to realize she's the one with the power. Owen confirmed that every account was structured with me as primary holder and Sterling as secondary or authorized user, which meant I could revoke his access unilaterally without his signature or consent. He'd prepared documentation for the asset freeze and agreed to execute it at exactly midnight on summit night, timing it so Sterling would discover his financial powerlessness at the worst possible moment, probably when trying to check into a hotel after finding himself locked out of the penthouse. When Silas finished outlining the entire strategy, he'd leaned back in his leather chair and studied me with an expression that was part admiration, part assessment, gauging whether I actually had the stomach to go through with something this comprehensive and brutal. "When do you want to detonate this bomb?" he'd asked, his voice casual, as if we were discussing dinner plans rather than the complete destruction of a man's life. I didn't hesitate, didn't second guess, didn't feel even a flicker of doubt about the righteousness of what we were planning. 3 weeks, I'd said. At the summit. Silas had raised an eyebrow. The luxury business summit? That's the most public venue you could choose. Divorces can be quiet, Mrs. Blackwood. Are you certain you want to make this public? I'd met his eyes and felt something cold and certain settle into place in my chest. He humiliated me in whispers for months. Snide comments at meetings, dismissive gestures in front of colleagues, treating me like I was his assistant rather than his partner. I'll destroy him in headlines. I want everyone who watched him treat me like nothing to see exactly who he really is, and exactly who owned everything all along. Silas had smiled then, not his professional attorney smile, but something genuine and almost predatory. The smile of someone who loved his job when it involved taking down arrogant men who'd underestimated their opponents. "There's one more thing you should know," he'd said, pulling out a document I recognized immediately, our prenuptial agreement. Sterling had insisted on it before we married, claiming it was standard for successful people and that it would protect both of us. I'd signed it without argument because at the time I'd been in love and trusting and believed we'd never need it. Silas had reviewed it with 3 other attorneys, and they'd all reached the same conclusion: it's unenforceable. Sterling's attorney made multiple technical errors in the drafting, wrong venue jurisdiction, improper disclosure of assets, failure to allow sufficient time for independent counsel review. But here's the beautiful part. Even if it were enforceable, it only protects premarital assets. And your premarital assets, the seed funding for the company, the initial investment capital, those were yours. The prenup he insisted on actually protects you more than him. Sterling had been so confident about that prenup, had treated it like his insurance policy against a gold-digging wife, had probably never read it carefully enough to realize it was worthless. His arrogance once again had destroyed him. I'd left Silas's office with a file folder 3 inches thick, containing the complete strategy for Sterling's downfall, and for the first time in months, I'd felt something like hope. Not hope for reconciliation or healing, but hope for justice. For the satisfaction of watching someone who'd hurt you face consequences for their actions. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to prepare, to plan, to make sure every detail was perfect. And then Sterling Blackwood would learn the truth. He'd never owned anything at all. The alliance formed in Silas Novak's conference room on a Tuesday evening after business hours, when the building was empty except for security and the cleaning crew, who knew better than to ask questions about late-night meetings. I'd assembled my team, Silas with his legal expertise and 3 decades of dismantling powerful men, Cassian with his evidence files and cynical understanding of human nature, Layla, who'd been my anchor through every storm, and Owen Beck from the bank, who'd quietly been documenting Sterling's financial recklessness for months. We spread documents across the conference table like generals planning a siege, and for the first time since discovering Sterling's betrayal, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. "We have 3 weeks to coordinate every moving piece," Silas said, pointing to the timeline he'd drawn on the whiteboard. "One mistake, one leak, one piece of information that reaches Sterling before summit night, and this entire strategy collapses. Everyone in this room needs to understand we're building something that cannot fail, because we won't get a second chance." Julian Vance's phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was reviewing client contracts, and the panic in his voice was immediately apparent, even through the careful professional language he tried to maintain. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to speak with you privately about a sensitive company matter," he'd said, his words clipped and nervous. Not at the office, somewhere discreet. It's urgent. We met at a hotel restaurant across town where neither of us would be recognized, and Julian had arrived 10 minutes early, already on his second coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the cup. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, rumpled suit, the appearance of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks and was carrying a weight that was crushing him from the inside. "I know what Sterling's doing," he'd said the moment I sat down, not bothering with pleasantries or small talk. "I know about the offshore accounts, the shell company, the embezzlement, and I need you to know that I never wanted any part of it, but he's my boss, and I thought—" His voice cracked. "I thought if I went along with it, I'd be safe. But now I'm realizing I'm not safe at all. I'm an accessory to fraud, and I could go to jail." Over coffee that neither of us drank, Julian provided everything. Emails where Sterling had explicitly instructed him to falsify expense reports and route payments through Esme's shell company, recordings of meetings where they discussed the plan to dissolve Blackwood Luxury Solutions and exclude me from the reincorporated entity, documents showing the systematic movement of money offshore. "He told me you'd agreed to step back from the business," Julian said, his voice hollow with the realization of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. "He said this was all part of a planned restructuring that you'd approved, that we were just keeping it quiet until the timing was right." I should have questioned it. I should have talked to you directly. But Sterling was so confident, so convincing, and I needed this job. He'd brought physical copies of everything, organized in folders with tabs and dates, because he said he didn't trust digital files anymore. Sterling could delete those, but paper was permanent. "I'll testify," Julian said, meeting my eyes with desperate sincerity. "I'll tell everything I know to the SEC, to the police, to whoever you need me to tell. Just please, please don't let me go to prison for something I never wanted to be part of." I recorded Julian's confession on my phone with his permission, then had him provide a written statement that Silas later notarized and filed with the appropriate authorities. In exchange, Silas negotiated limited immunity for Julian. He'd have to resign as CFO and likely face fines and professional sanctions, but no criminal charges if he cooperated fully and testified truthfully about Sterling's role as the architect of the fraud. "You're getting a second chance that most people don't get," I told Julian as we concluded our meeting, and I meant it without kindness or forgiveness, just statement of fact. Don't waste it by trying to protect Sterling or minimizing what happened. The only way you survive this is by telling the complete truth. Julian had nodded, relief and shame warring on his face, and when he left the restaurant, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his choices, but maybe, possibly, ready to carry the consequences honestly. His testimony would be the final piece of evidence that connected every thread of Sterling's embezzlement into a pattern that couldn't be explained away as misunderstanding or creative accounting. Layla's role wasn't legal or investigative, but something more essential. She was the person who kept me human during weeks when I felt myself turning into something cold and calculating. We met for lunch twice a week, and she'd look at me with those knowing eyes and ask, "How are you really doing?" Not "How's the case coming" or "What's the strategy?" but genuinely checking whether I was surviving the emotional devastation of watching my marriage revealed as a lie. "You're allowed to grieve even while you're planning his downfall," she'd told me over soup I couldn't eat, reaching across the table to grip my hand hard enough to hurt. "Being strategic doesn't mean you can't be sad. Being strong doesn't mean you can't break down. You're not a robot, Anya. You're a woman whose husband betrayed her in the worst possible way, and you're entitled to mourn that." She gave me permission to be both things at once, the warrior building a fortress and the wounded woman mourning 7 years of wasted love. The emotional breakdown came in my car, after a particularly intense meeting with Silas where we'd reviewed Dr. Vivian Xian's therapy notes, and reading Sterling's documented cruelty in clinical professional language had finally cracked the armor I'd been maintaining for weeks. I'd made it to the parking garage before the sobs started, great heaving gasps that felt like they were tearing me apart from the inside out. I cried for the marriage I'd thought I had, for the man I'd believed Sterling was, for the 7 years I'd given to someone who'd seen me as an obstacle rather than a partner. I cried for the woman I'd been a few months ago who still believed in us, who would have done anything to save what we'd built, who loved him despite all his flaws. I screamed into the silence of my car, beating my fists against the steering wheel until my hands ached, mourning not what was but what I'd believed existed. The shared dreams, the partnership, the future I'd imagined growing old together. For 20 minutes I let myself completely fall apart, gave in to the grief and rage and devastating sense of betrayal that I'd been holding back while building my legal case. After the breakdown, something shifted inside me. The grief was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but it no longer controlled me. I wiped my face, fixed my makeup in the rearview mirror, and felt something hard and certain crystallize in my chest where the pain had been. I'm not doing this for revenge, I said out loud to my reflection, testing the words to see if they were true. I'm doing this for justice, for every woman who's been erased from her own story, for every person who's been gaslit into doubting their own reality, for the woman I used to be who deserved better than what he gave her. The distinction mattered. Revenge was personal and petty and ultimately hollow, but justice was righteous and necessary, and would outlast whatever satisfaction I'd feel watching Sterling's world crumble. I was fighting not just for myself, but for the principle that actions have consequences, that betrayal cannot go unpunished, that women who build empires don't disappear quietly when men decide they're inconvenient. The final preparations moved forward with military precision. Divorce papers drafted, reviewed, and ready to file the morning of the summit, scheduled to be processed at 9 a.m. when the courthouse opened. The locksmith I'd hired was a professional who specialized in rapid security changes for domestic situations, and he deed-blocked 6 p.m. on summit night to change every lock on the penthouse and reprogram the building's access codes. Owen had prepared the account freeze documentation, scheduled to execute automatically at midnight, with codes he'd changed that morning, so even he couldn't reverse it once set in motion. Cassian had confirmed he'd be at the summit with a camera, documenting everything for the divorce proceedings and potential criminal case. Silas had the board meeting agenda prepared for the following morning, the vote to remove Sterling as CEO already a foregone conclusion based on my majority ownership. Every piece was in place, every person knew their role, every document was signed and ready. All that remained was for summit night to arrive, and for Sterling to hand me the public humiliation that would justify, in the eyes of everyone watching, what came next. Recruiting Nico Flores felt almost anticlimactic after everything else, but his role was symbolically important. He would be the messenger, the neighbor who'd witnessed months of Sterling's affair, and who would deliver the words that made Sterling understand how completely his world had changed. I'd knocked on Nico's door on a Saturday morning with coffee and the truth, explaining that I was divorcing my husband, that the locks would be changed, summit night, and that I needed someone to deliver a message when Sterling arrived home. I've watched him bring that woman into your building for months, Nico had said, anger flashing in his usually calm eyes. I've seen you come home late from work, exhausted, while he parades his mistress past your neighbors like we're all blind or stupid. I'll deliver your message, Mrs. Blackwood. And I'll make sure he understands that everyone saw, everyone knew, and everyone will remember. I'd written the message on elegant cardstock, my handwriting steady and sure. She said to tell you that you don't live here anymore. And one more thing, you never did. Nico had read it, smiled grimly, and promised to be waiting in the hallway when Sterling arrived. 2 days before the summit, I tried on the red Valentino dress in my bedroom while Sterling was at the office, probably with Esme, probably making final plans for the future they'd never have. The dress fit perfectly. I'd lost weight during the past few weeks of stress and sleepless nights, but somehow that made the dress more striking, more severe, more like armor than evening wear. I stared at myself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Same features, same body, but something fundamental had changed in my eyes, in the set of my jaw, in the way I held my spine. I looked harder, sharper, dangerous in a way I'd never been before, like someone who'd walked through fire and emerged as something new and unbreakable. You can do this, I whispered to my reflection, and the woman in the mirror stared back with eyes that held no doubt, no fear, only cold certainty about what was coming. In 48 hours, Sterling Blackwood would stand in front of colleagues and clients and deliver the public humiliation he'd been rehearsing for months. And I would smile, walk away, and let him enjoy his victory for exactly 2 hours before his entire world collapsed around him. Let the final act begin. The morning of the summit, I woke at dawn to watch the sunrise over the city and think about the fact that this was the last morning I'd wake up as Sterling Blackwood's wife, at least emotionally, if not yet legally on paper. My phone buzzed with coordinated confirmation texts. Silas at 6:47 a.m., confirming the divorce papers would be filed at exactly 9 a.m. when the courthouse opened. Owen at 7:03 a.m., verifying the account freeze was programmed to execute at midnight. The locksmith at 7:15 a.m., confirming his 6 p.m. appointment to change every lock on the penthouse. Everything was moving forward, with the inevitability of a machine I'd built and set in motion. And all I had to do was play my part. Walk into that ballroom tonight, give Sterling the opportunity to humiliate me publicly, and then walk away knowing that his moment of triumph was actually his final performance, before the curtain fell forever. I made coffee with steady hands and watched the city wake up below me, and I felt eerily calm, like I was watching someone else's life from a great distance, rather than living inside the most consequential day of my own. Getting ready took longer than usual because I wanted everything to be perfect. Not for Sterling or the summit, but for myself, for the woman I was becoming. I styled my hair in loose waves that looked effortless but had taken 40 minutes to achieve, did my makeup with the precision of war paint, strong brows, dark lips, eyes lined sharp enough to cut. The red Valentino dress slid over my body like a second skin, and when I fastened my heels and stood at full height, I looked like someone who owned the room before even entering it. My phone buzzed with a text from Layla. "You've got this. Burn it down. I'm proud of you. Call me after." I smiled at that, grateful for a friend who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is support someone's decision to destroy what's destroying them. I took one final look in the mirror, barely recognized the powerful, dangerous woman staring back, and thought, Sterling has no idea what's coming for him. He thinks he's dealing with the wife he married 7 years ago, soft, trusting, eager to please. He's about to meet someone entirely different. Arriving at the summit felt surreal. The Grand Marquis Hotel lit up like a palace, luxury cars queuing for valet service, men in tuxedos and women in designer gowns streaming through the entrance, like we were attending a coronation rather than a networking event. I'd been to this summit every year since we'd founded the company, always arriving with Sterling, always playing the role of the supportive wife who smiled for photos and made small talk about market trends while Sterling worked the room collecting business cards and compliments. Tonight I arrived alone, head high, and I felt every eye that tracked my entrance across the lobby to the ballroom doors. The chandeliers inside sparkled with almost aggressive brightness. Champagne fountains flowed at 3 different stations. Ice sculptures melted slowly beside tables of catered delicacies that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budgets. It was opulence performing itself, wealth displaying its peacock feathers, and somewhere in this room full of powerful people, my husband was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Sterling and Esme were holding court at the bar, exactly where I knew they'd be. He always positioned himself in high-traffic areas where people would have to pass him, where he could intercept colleagues and clients and make sure everyone saw how important, how connected, how successful he was. Esme looked stunning in emerald green silk that probably cost more than the consulting fees she'd fraudulently billed our company, her hand possessive on Sterling's arm, her laugh carrying across the ballroom with practiced musicality. They were radiating confidence, untouchable in their shared delusion that they'd won, that they successfully engineered my erasure from the company and their path to European luxury. Sterling wore the tuxedo I'd paid for, drank champagne purchased with company funds I'd helped earn, and accepted congratulations from colleagues for a success built on my financial strategies and operational management. He looked like a king holding court, completely unaware that his kingdom was already gone and he was standing in ruins he just couldn't see yet. The whispers started the moment I entered the ballroom, and I felt them like insects crawling across my skin. People had heard rumors about trouble in the Blackwood marriage, had noticed Sterling and Esme's increasingly obvious affair, had probably been speculating for weeks about when I'd finally leave or confront him. Some colleagues met my eyes with sympathy or curiosity, Some averted their gaze in discomfort, some watched with barely concealed anticipation, like spectators hoping for drama they could gossip about later. I ignored them all, moving through the crowd with focused intention, accepting a glass of champagne I wouldn't drink just to have something to hold. My target was Sterling, and every step toward him felt like walking toward an execution. Not mine, his, though he didn't know it yet. I kept my face neutral, pleasant, professional, the mask of a woman who had nothing to hide and everything under control, and I watched Sterling notice my approach with an expression that flashed through surprise, annoyance, and finally calculation as he realized this was his opportunity. I approached Sterling professionally, calmly, with the kind of measured demeanor I'd perfected in 7 years of business negotiations and client presentations. "Sterling, I need to speak with you about the Henderson account," I said, my voice steady and reasonable despite my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough to hurt. "They've requested revised terms by Monday, and since you've been handling their relationship, I thought we should coordinate our response." It was innocuous, purely business, exactly the kind of conversation we'd had hundreds of times before. I was giving him every opportunity to respond civilly, professionally, to remember that regardless of our personal situation, we still ran a company together. But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't hearing a business inquiry. He was seeing an opportunity to assert dominance, to remind me and everyone watching exactly who held the power in this relationship. Esme's hand tightened on his arm, and her smirk told me she'd been waiting for this moment too, had probably encouraged it, had maybe even helped him rehearse the humiliation he was about to deliver. Sterling's public humiliation was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning this moment, waiting for the perfect audience and timing to deliver maximum impact. "Stop acting like you own me," he said loudly enough for the circle of colleagues around us to hear clearly, his voice carrying that edge of amused condescension that I'd learned to recognize as his cruelty disguised as humor. "You don't get to tell me where I go or who I'm with." The words hung in the air for a beat, and I watched faces around us register shock, discomfort, second-hand embarrassment at witnessing such a public marital dispute. Then someone laughed, a nervous, uncomfortable sound that gave permission to others, and suddenly there were chuckles rippling through our professional circle, people who'd eaten dinner at our home now laughing at my public diminishment. Esme's smirk widened into something triumphant, and Sterling looked so satisfied, so convinced of his own dominance, that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. This was the moment he'd been building toward, the public assertion that I was dismissible, manageable, ultimately powerless to stop what he was doing. The laughter felt like knives, like every colleague who chuckled was driving a blade between my ribs, and for a moment I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize, to make myself smaller so others would be comfortable. Some people in the circle looked genuinely uncomfortable. I saw a few women wince, saw one of our longtime clients look away in secondhand shame, but enough people were laughing that Sterling felt vindicated, emboldened, convinced he'd successfully put me in my place in front of everyone who mattered. Esme leaned into him with proprietary satisfaction, and I could read in her body language that she believed this moment marked her official ascension to Sterling's partner, his equal, his future. She thought she'd won. The ballroom seemed to pulse with champagne-soaked judgment. 300 people in designer clothes watching the Blackwood marriage publicly implode, and I stood in my red dress feeling every eye on me, every whisper about me, every assumption that I was the scorned wife who'd been outmaneuvered by a younger, more sophisticated replacement. I smiled, not a fake smile, not a broken smile, but a genuine expression of something that felt disturbingly close to joy, because I knew what no one else in this room knew. The game was already over and Sterling had already lost. "You're right," I said, my voice clear and steady as a bell cutting through the awkward laughter that was already dying into uncomfortable silence. "We're not together anymore." The words landed like a bomb in the sudden quiet, and I watched Sterling's face register confusion. This wasn't the script he'd expected. I was supposed to react with tears or anger or defensive explanations, not calm agreement, but I didn't give him time to process or respond, didn't offer explanation or clarification, just turned on my heel with deliberate precision and walked out of that ballroom with my spine straight and my head high. Red Louboutins clicked against marble like a countdown timer. my red dress trailing behind me like blood and water, and the silence I left behind was louder than any scream could have been. I didn't run, didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I just left, removing myself from Sterling's moment of triumph with the kind of dignity that transforms humiliation into something else entirely. Anya exited the hotel through the main entrance, where valets scrambled to bring cars, and I tipped the young man generously when he delivered my Mercedes, because in an hour, he'd probably hear about what just happened inside, and I wanted him to remember me as composed and in control. I drove away slowly, deliberately, watching the Grand Marquis Hotel shrink in my rearview mirror like a chapter closing, a door shutting on 7 years of my life that were now officially over. The city lights blurred past my windows as I drove nowhere in particular, just moving, just putting distance between myself and that ballroom full of people who'd watched Sterling try to break me. My phone showed 8:47 p.m., which meant in 1 hour and 13 minutes the locksmith would change the locks on the penthouse. And in 3 hours and 13 minutes, Owen would freeze every account Sterling thought he controlled. The machinery of Sterling's destruction was already in motion, grinding forward with mechanical inevitability, and there was nothing he could do to stop it because he didn't even know it was happening. I allowed myself to imagine his face when his key wouldn't turn in the lock, when Nico delivered my message, when he realized that his moment of triumph at the summit had been the opening act of his complete and total downfall. As I walked through the hotel corridor toward the exit, I passed Julian Vance standing near the coat check, and our eyes met for just a fraction of a second. He gave me the smallest nod, barely perceptible, a gesture that said, "I'm ready. My testimony is secure. I won't break under pressure." I returned the nod with equal subtlety, and we passed each other like strangers while everything we'd built together remained unspoken but understood. Then, as I pushed through the doors into the night air, I saw him, Cassian Hale in the shadows near the valet stand, camera in hand with a telephoto lens, and I knew without asking that he'd documented everything: Sterling's cruelty, my composure, Esme's triumph, the crowd's laughter. All of it captured in high-resolution photos that would become evidence in divorce proceedings and possibly criminal trials. Frozen moments of betrayal that couldn't be explained away or rewritten in Sterling's favor. Cassian lifted his camera slightly in acknowledgement, and I smiled, a real smile this time, cold and satisfied, because every piece was in place, every person knew their role, and the fortress I'd built was about to prove itself absolutely impenetrable. Sterling Blackwood's fall had begun, and he didn't even know he was already in free fall. After Anya left the ballroom, Sterling basked in what he believed was his greatest victory, accepting congratulations from colleagues who'd witnessed his public dominance. He ordered another round of champagne, his arm tight around Esme's waist as he held court. "She's been holding me back for years," he told anyone who'd listen. "Now I can finally build the company I always envisioned." Sterling felt invincible, untouchable, like a king who just vanquished a rival. Esme smiled beside him, victorious and vindicated, believing she'd won the prize she'd been chasing for months. Sterling and Esme retreated to their hotel penthouse suite around 11 p.m., riding the elevator in champagne-soaked triumph. The suite was opulent. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble bathroom, a view that made you feel like you ruled the city. They toasted with expensive whiskey to freedom, to Paris, to their future. "To us," Sterling said, and to Anya finally knowing her place. Esme laughed, and they kissed with the passion of people who believed they'd gotten away with everything. But around 11:30, Sterling grew restless. "I need to go to the penthouse," he announced. "Grab some documents, pack some things," Esme protested, but Sterling insisted. "I still live there. She can't stop me." The drive home felt like a victory lap to Sterling, the streets glittering with possibility as he navigated toward the penthouse. He was tipsy enough to feel invincible, but sober enough to drive, or so he told himself. He rehearsed what he'd say if Anya was home, practicing his dismissive tone. "This is business, nothing personal," he'd tell her. He imagined her crying, apologizing, maybe even begging him to reconsider. The fantasy made him smile. He'd be magnanimous in victory, offer her a generous settlement. After all, he wasn't cruel. He was just a man who'd outgrown his starter wife. Sterling arrived at the Penthouse building at 11:52 p.m., rode the elevator humming some tune he couldn't name. He approached the door with his keys already out. This was muscle memory, this was home. The key slid in smoothly, then refused to turn. Sterling frowned, tried again. Nothing. He pulled the key out, examined it, then tried again with more force. Still nothing. Confusion bloomed into frustration. Had the lock jammed? And frustration crystallized into panic as Sterling tried his backup key with the same useless result. "What the hell?" he muttered, jiggling the doorknob aggressively. Nico Flores's door opened with deliberate timing, and the neighbor emerged with calm purpose. "Mr. Blackwood?" Nico said, his voice neutral and professional. "Mrs. Blackwood asked me to give you a message." Sterling stared at Nico, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "What message?" Sterling demanded. "And what's wrong with my door?" Nico held Sterling's gaze steadily, his expression neither pity nor satisfaction, just calm certainty of someone delivering uncomfortable truth. "She said to tell you that you don't live here anymore," Nico relayed with careful precision. "And one more thing, you never did. Legally speaking, sir, this has always been her property." The words took a moment to land, and Sterling's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror. "That's ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "This is my home. I bought this penthouse." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Had he bought it? Or had Anya handled that transaction? Nico shrugged slightly. "I'm just telling you what she asked me to say. You might want to call your attorney." Then Nico stepped back into his unit and closed the door with a soft, final click. Sterling exploded into frantic action, pulling out his phone to call Anya. Straight to voicemail, not even ringing. He called again. Same result. He tried the building's front desk, and the night doorman answered with uncomfortable formality. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, but I've been instructed not to grant you access. You're no longer listed as a resident." Sterling's voice cracked as he demanded to speak to the building manager. "I'm sorry, sir. The manager won't be available until Monday morning. Mrs. Blackwood is the sole owner of the property, and she's revoked your access." Sterling tried to check into a hotel, the Carlyle first, then the Grand Marquis, then increasingly cheaper options as each credit card declined. He stood in the fourth hotel lobby, listening to an automated message. "This account has been frozen pending investigation." He pulled up his banking app with trembling hands, and the screen showed zeros across every account. Checking, savings, company card, everything. Access denied. Account suspended. Sterling's breath came in short gasps as reality crashed down around him like a building collapsing, each revelation another level of his life crumbling into rubble. Sterling sat in his car outside the penthouse at 2 a.m., making desperate calls to anyone who might help. Julian Vance didn't answer. The call went straight to voicemail, like Julian had deliberately declined it. His attorney didn't answer because it was 2 a.m. He tried Esme 5 times before she finally answered with a sharp, "What?" "My husband knows," she said, her voice ragged. "Someone sent him everything. His lawyer called. I'm being sued for fraud and adultery." Sterling tried to speak, but Esme cut him off. "Don't call me again, we're done." She hung up. Sterling sat alone, watching the dark penthouse windows, and for the first time in his adult life had no idea what to do next. I wasn't there when Sterling's key didn't work. Wasn't there to see his face when Nico delivered my message. But Nico called me at 12:47 a.m. to confirm. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've lived in this building for 15 years. I've never seen a man crumble so completely." I'd thanked Nico and felt something loosen in my chest. Not joy, just profound relief that justice was being served. I slept better that night than I had in months. When Cassian's text came at 3 a.m., a photo of Esme's husband receiving the evidence package, followed by her lawyer already contacted her. "She's done." I smiled in the darkness and let sleep take me again. By morning, news had spread through our social and business circles like wildfire. Sterling and Anya Blackwood were divorcing, and the details were spectacularly ugly. Whispers at breakfast became outright discussions by coffee breaks, and by lunch the story had grown: embezzlement, affair, the wife who'd secretly owned everything. People I hadn't spoken to in years called Layla, asking if rumors were true. The business community is small, and betrayal makes irresistible narrative, especially involving money, power, and an underestimated woman finally revealing her hand. Sterling tried entering company offices Monday morning and met security protocols I'd implemented Sunday night. He arrived at 8 a.m., probably having slept in his car, looking rumpled and desperate, only to have his keycard denied. "Mr. Blackwood is no longer employed here. He's not permitted access," Sterling argued, threatened, demanded to speak to someone in charge, but the guard remained impassive. When Sterling called Julian Vance, his former CFO answered with 2 sentences. "My attorney advised me not to speak with you. Contact your own lawyer." Then Julian hung up, and Sterling stood outside the building he'd thought was his headquarters, locked out of another piece of his former life. Esme's collapse was happening simultaneously, and Cassian kept me updated. Her husband filed for divorce before dawn, and by 9 a.m. process servers delivered papers with a restraining order. Her consulting clients received anonymous packages detailing her history of targeting wealthy married men, and everyone terminated contracts by noon. Sterling tried calling her repeatedly, but Esme had blocked his number, deleted social media, and was planning to leave the state. The woman who'd worn emerald green and victory 12 hours ago had vanished like smoke, abandoning Sterling to face consequences alone. The legal avalanche began at 9 a.m. with Silas filing corporate fraud charges, supported by Julian's testimony, Cassian's evidence, and financial records showing systematic embezzlement. At 10 a.m., the company board convened for an emergency meeting I'd called, using my majority ownership. The vote was unanimous, 7-0. Sterling Blackwood was terminated for cause, stripped of title and equity, banned from future involvement. It was swift and brutal. By 10:47 a.m., Sterling's email was deactivated, his name scraped from the website, and security was boxing his office belongings. Media attention came by early afternoon. Business journals picked up the story when someone leaked board meeting minutes. "Luxury brand CEO ousted after embezzlement scandal," read the Business Chronicle headline, followed by increasingly detailed articles about Sterling's affair, shell company, offshore accounts. By Tuesday morning, Sterling's face was on the financial section's front page, his reputation disintegrated in headlines, reduced from successful entrepreneur to common thief. Every article mentioned me as the wife and co-founder who actually owned the company and exposed the fraud. My phone rang constantly with interview requests I declined. The facts spoke loud enough. Julian's testimony to federal investigators was comprehensive and damning. Emails where Sterling explicitly instructed falsification, recordings of embezzlement discussions, documentation of every offshore transfer. What Sterling thought was clever fraud was amateur-hour criminality so careless that prosecutors called it the easiest white-collar case they'd seen in years. Sterling faced civil penalties, divorce, and potential federal fraud charges carrying years in prison. Julian, granted immunity for cooperation, had turned over everything, and Sterling's arrogance had created the paper trail that would convict him. Owen Beck's international banking contacts froze the offshore accounts with Cayman Islands cooperation. Even tax havens draw the line at obvious criminality. The $847,000 Sterling and Esme had stolen was frozen pending investigation and would eventually return to the company. Sterling couldn't access a single dollar, couldn't fund his defense, couldn't flee to Europe. Every escape avenue had been systematically closed, and he was trapped in wreckage of his own making with no resources to rebuild. Sterling's downward spiral was documented in increasingly desperate voicemails he left. I didn't answer, but saved every message as harassment evidence. He was staying in a budget motel near the airport, fielding angry calls from investors. Former friends stopped returning calls. His attorney, after reviewing evidence, told Sterling the case was unwinnable and recommended taking whatever settlement Silas offered. "How could you do this to me?" Sterling's last voicemail asked, his voice breaking. "After everything we built together?" I deleted it without listening completely. The answer was obvious. He'd done this to himself. Public opinion turned Sterling into an internet sensation for wrong reasons. Social media erupted with the story, and I'd become an unexpected symbol of empowerment. LinkedIn praised my strategic thinking. Twitter analyzed my long-game revenge. Feminist blogs wrote about fighting back against financial abuse. I didn't seek attention and found it uncomfortable, but public sentiment was overwhelmingly on my side. Sterling was cast as villain in a morality play about greed and betrayal, and I was the protagonist who refused erasure from her own story. The narrative had taken on a life of its own. I sat in my office, formerly ours, now definitively mine, looking at rebranding plans. Blackwood Luxury Solutions would become Volkov Collective, with new logo and vision emphasizing integrity, transparency, genuine service. I'd begun reaching out to clients personally, assuring them of stability under my sole leadership. Most were supportive, some enthusiastic. "We always knew you were the real brains," one CEO told me. Sterling's era was over, and something new was beginning. People love a good downfall, and Sterling's was spectacular. Overnight he went from industry darling to cautionary tale. "How the mighty fall," they whispered. But here's what they didn't understand. He was never mighty. He was just loud, and I was always the one holding the foundation. Now that foundation was mine alone, and I was building something better. Sterling's lawyer approached Silas with a settlement offer. Sterling would sign over everything, plead guilty to reduce charges, accept probation instead of prison if I dropped the most serious fraud claims. I was considering it. Not because Sterling deserved mercy, but because I wanted this finished. Justice had been served. The rest was just paperwork. 6 months later, I stood in my office, not ours, mine, and reflected on everything that had changed since that night at the summit. Sterling had taken the plea deal Silas negotiated, guilty to corporate fraud, 5 years probation, $2.3 million in restitution. No prison time, which some thought too lenient, but I didn't care about him rotting in a cell. What mattered was the permanent stain on his record. He'd never work in our industry again. He'd moved out of state, taken a low-paying consulting job, and from what I heard, he was miserable. Esme's fate was almost poetic. Divorced, disgraced, facing fraud charges in multiple jurisdictions as prosecutors connected her pattern across 3 states. She'd moved to the Midwest, changed her name back to Emily Dawson, and was working in retail while fighting legal battles she couldn't afford. Her social climbing dreams had crashed spectacularly. She'd tried to steal my life and ended up with nothing. I didn't think about her anymore. She was a character in a story I'd already finished reading. The company rebrand exceeded every expectation. Blackwood Luxury Solutions became Volkov Collective, named after the woman who'd actually built it. Under my sole leadership, revenue climbed 23% in the first quarter, as clients appreciated the transparency and integrity I'd restored. Julian Vance stayed on as CFO under strict oversight, and to his credit, he'd become obsessively ethical, double-checking every expense, flagging anything remotely questionable. The new culture felt cleaner, more authentic, finally aligned with the values I'd always believed in but Sterling had treated as optional. Personal transformation is strange. You don't notice it happening until you realize you're fundamentally different. I was harder now, less willing to tolerate excuses or mediocrity, more direct because I'd learned the cost of silence. Yet I was softer too, more compassionate toward those struggling with difficult choices, more patient with human imperfection. I trusted more carefully, verified more thoroughly, but I hadn't become cynical, I'd become wiser. And I loved more intentionally than ever before. The penthouse had been completely redone. Gone was Sterling's sterile minimalism, replaced with warm textures and color. Every piece of furniture he'd chosen was sold or donated. I started fresh, with comfort, beauty, and intention. Even the master bedroom was transformed, new mattress, new linens, new paint, because I refused to sleep in a space haunted by betrayal. It finally felt like mine, a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. Coming home no longer brought dread, only peace. Layla had been my anchor through it all, and our friendship had deepened into something rare, the kind of bond forged in crisis and tempered by love. We had lunch every week. She'd become the sister I never had, celebrating victories and sitting with me through the moments when grief still caught me off guard. "You're a cautionary tale for cheating husbands everywhere," she'd joked recently, and we'd laughed until we cried. In that laughter, I realized I'd reclaimed something Sterling tried to steal: my joy, my lightness, my ability to be fully present with people who deserved me. What surprised me most was the peace. I'd expected triumph, maybe anger, but instead I felt free. The weight of his betrayal had lifted gradually, until one morning I realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about him. I was building something new, not just a company, but a life that reflected who I truly was, rather than who I'd been for someone else. The bitterness I'd feared never came. It burned away, leaving clarity, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice once served lets you move forward without shadows. Dating again felt strange, like relearning a forgotten language. I'd been to a few dinners with Marcus, a kind architect Layla introduced me to. He was gentle, funny, and refreshingly unimpressed by my success. We'd been on 4 dates. No pressure, no expectations. For the first time in my adult life, I was content being alone, content in my own company. Any relationship I entered now would be because I wanted it, not because I needed it to feel complete. Nico Flores, the neighbor who'd once delivered that fateful message, had become an unlikely friend. We met for coffee occasionally, talking about life and starting over. Last week we'd laughed on his balcony about that night, about Sterling's face, about how perfectly everything had fallen into place despite the chaos. "I've never felt more honored to deliver a message in my life," Nico had said, raising his coffee cup. To women who know their worth, I'd clinked my cup against his, grateful for the unexpected friendships that grow from ruin. Now, standing on my balcony at sunset, I watched the city stretch beneath me like a kingdom I'd fought to keep and transformed into something better. The sky burned orange and gold, endings and beginnings blending together. One chapter closing, another waiting. They asked if I wanted revenge, I whispered to the glowing skyline. I said no. I wanted justice. But what I got was better. I got myself back. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Sorry, I recognized Sterling's attempt at redemption, deleted it without responding, and blocked the number. Some apologies come too late. He was my past. The city below was my future, bright, infinite, and finally completely mine. If you've ever been dismissed, betrayed, or underestimated, remember this: you are not defined by what was done to you, but by how you rise from it. Document everything. Know your worth. Build your fortress. Never apologize for demanding the justice you deserve. Your story isn't over, it's just beginning.